Do we have the requisite laws to sustain this reform? Because the consumer, at the end of the day, because they still complain in the telecom sector, but now with the power sector, how would that play out?
Sorry, I didn't get you.
Do we have the requisite laws to sustain this reform, this handover to successor companies, especially as it has to do with protecting the consumer?
Oh, the Electricity Power Reform Act 2005 is the legal basis for which we got to this stage. If you recall, we had one monolithic company called NEPA that had monopoly powers. If you wanted power extended to your location and NEPA was not in a position to do it, and you bought the poles and the cables and extended the power, those poles and cables became NEPA's property. If you generated power and put it through a meter, it was read and you had to pay NEPA for generating power for them. Now, this monopoly law was abrogated by the Electricity Power Sector Reform Act 2005. Now, that act liberalized the sector and also created an independent regulatory agencies called Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission. The Nigeria Regulatory Commission is the policeman of the sector. It issues licenses, it issues guidelines, it issues tariff structure, and ensures that everybody behaves properly. That is why nobody can charge anything above the multi-year tariff order that is in operation now. The operators in that sector have to abide by the rulings of the Regulatory Commission. And in establishing the MITO, the Regulatory Commission takes into consideration all the variables that are very critical to production of power. The cost of capital, the gestation period it takes to set up a plant, and so on and so forth, are all factored into the tariff order. So NAC ensures that everybody is good behavior. And inherent in the reform was that the company NEPA was broken down into subsidiary companies that we call successor companies that have now been privatized, so that competition is introduced into the sector. The generation department that housed all the generation capacity was broken down into 6 distribution companies and sold to 6 different entities that are not in any way related, way introducing competition. And we know that once there's competition in a sector, if you remember, we were buying SIM cards at 50,000 naira, 30,000 naira. How much do we buy SIM cards today? They come for free time. And this is what will happen in the power sector because there is competition. Competition has been introduced. And besides
Mr.
the 6
Dikki,
generation companies, we have other IPPs that are also developing generation capacity. Then the IPPs will also be privatized, and competition will force the market into giving the best prices and the best service to the consumers.
Well, Mr. Dikki, if you can hear me, I just wanted to, get your word on what you have to say to those people who are not as optimistic as you, because this is not the first time we've seen a government institution, in fact, what should serve as a backbone of industrialization. We've seen what's happened to the steel industry. Some of our viewers have sent in messages saying, till date, nothing is happening with the steel industries, it was saying. What is the guarantee that something will definitely happen in the power sector as it should, or as you are projecting? What word of assurance do you have for them?
Well, do we have another more viable alternative than this? I'll give you a statistics. Since 1960, we've been budgeting and investing in power, and we have not increased capacity beyond 6,000 megawatts. Do you want us to go back to those days? And like I've mentioned, once you create an enabling environment for the private sector, they move in and bring in efficiency. We have concessioned the ports. Since the ports were concessioned, government had not spent a dime on the ports. And the concessionaires are improving and improving the infrastructure and improving the efficiency of the ports. This is what is going to happen when you allow private sector to move into a critical sector like power. I sympathize with those who are pessimistic. All I can tell them is just wait and see what's going to happen.
Well, for the stories of success, you also have, you know, some stories of not so successful ventures in terms of privatization. But let's take a look at, you know, even the prices. I don't know if you've come across this article. It's written by Henry Boyo, who says that it seems that we've spent a lot of money to, you know, to sell this, to get these companies out there to be privatized, but we've made a very huge loss from the sale of PHCN assets. What do you have to say to that? Is that true? And how does the federal government intend to mitigate that if indeed it is true?
A huge loss indeed. Now, let me tell you, investments in this power infrastructure, some of them are as old as 30 years in age. Technologies have moved on. Some of this equipment have not been maintained. Like there's one generation plant that has not had a comprehensive turnaround maintenance for 30 years. Now, how much is that plant going to be worth? It is obsolete. It is, when you go to the control room and you compare it with the modern control rooms of typical power generation plants that are coming on stream now, you will now laugh at those who are talking about undervaluation. People forget that if an asset stays for 30 years, it does not appreciate in value. It actually depreciates. So, and then there's obsolescence of technology. Whoever is taking over these plants has to contend with the fact that the manufacturers of the spare parts have moved on to other more modern equipment. And for them to get the spare parts to run these plants, they have to probably make special orders. These are all part of the cost of operating these aged plants. And of course, valuation is not a science. It's subject to individual opinion. I can value an asset because I want to achieve political gain and tell you that this national asset have been undervalued and given out for free. But any realist knows that an asset does not appreciate in value over a period of time.
You know, Mr. Dikki, what you seem to be confirming is that indeed monies were budgeted for the turnaround maintenance of these facilities, but it would seem that none of it was spent, because what he seems to be quoting are things that have just been said in the last 10 years. For instance, he says that the Minister of Power said that $3.2 billion, an average of $3.2 billion have been spent on the power sector in the last 10 years. Are we saying that we spent so much money in these areas and there was nothing to show for it when eventually we're going to put up these companies for sale?
Those $3.2 billion you are quoting were spent on the NIPP plants. The 10 plants that Mr. President has commenced the commissioning of them. He has so far commissioned 2, Geregu and Omotosho. Those $3.2 billion were spent in building new capacity, and 10 new plants are already on the verge of being commissioned. They will bring into the power grid about 5,000 megawatts of power. Those are solid investments, verifiable, and you can go and see the plants. And I'm sure channels covered the coverage of the commissioning of Geregu and Omotosho by Mr. President. So those are the assets into which those $3.2 billion have gone into. But I'm talking about the amounts of monies that have been spent before then. But there was no increase in capacity. There was no increase in transmission capabilities. Power remained static at 6,000 megawatts, and over 30 years of budgeting. We should move on.
All right, well, what can you tell us about this allegation making the rounds that the technical committee of the NCP and yourself waived the bid guidelines and unilaterally awarded Enugu Distribution Company to Interstate?
Okay, let me understand what you mean by unilateral. I'll explain. Interstate expressed interest when it was advertised, and they were evaluated and they crossed the EOI stage. They were issued RFP and they were asked to submit technical and financial proposals. They submitted a technical proposal that was evaluated by international standards under the watchful eyes of EFCC, ICPC, SSS, NIAF, CPCS, and other international organizations of repute. And they were found, their submission was found to be technically competent to run Enugu Distribution Company. They moved on to the financial bid opening stage and emerged the preferred bidder. They paid 25% of the proceeds by the 21st of March. It is on the payment of the balance of 75% that issues arose. Now, there are guidelines. The provision in the sales agreement is that government reserve the right to take back these companies if certain conditions are not fulfilled. And so for government to take back these companies, they cannot take the assets alone without the liabilities. So there is a provision in the sales agreement that says BP must approve the financing arrangements made by each bidder to acquire the enterprise. They were supposed to get that clearance before the due date of payment. Interstate came in with a letter requesting for approval of their facility on the 20th, when the closing date was the 21st. The facility was obtained in the name of a sister company. And we in BP told them, gentlemen, this facility is not in the name of Interstate. We do not see any nexus between this facility that is sourced by a sister company and the purchase of Enugu Distribution Company. So, establish a nexus. As it stands, we cannot approve this facility. That was on the 20th. On the 21st, they came in with further explanations and showed the nexus between Interstate and the sister company that procured the facilities. So we gave them a letter granting them conditional approval that they must bring an MOU that links Interstate with the sister company that was securing the financing. And we dispatched the letter. Now, there is also a clause in the sales agreement that says if 3 conditions are not made, the bidder can seek for extension by 20 days. 1, if the industry documents are not ready. Number 2, if the approvals of the facilities issues arose. And thirdly, another issue that was not relevant in this case. So once we gave them that letter, Interstate now wrote invoking that clause that gives them an extension by 20 days, which is in the agreement that has been given to every bidder. They wrote invoking that clause, and we simply took the matter to technical committee and said, technical committee, by the 21st day of August, Interstate has not paid a penny. But they have written a letter invoking a clause in the sales agreement. We lay it to the table, on the table for you to deliberate and make recommendations to NCP. Technical committee deliberated and made their recommendations to NCP. NCP sat and deliberated and said, yes, Interstate has validly invoked the clause because it is in the agreement. Has validly invoked the clause because it is in the agreement. So we approve their demand for the 20 days extension, and incidentally, before the expiration of the 20 days, Interstate made full payment. So there's nothing like unilateral. There's nothing like dashing Interstate, the company. They competed fair and square and won, and also invoked the rules in the agreement, which anybody who was a bidder was entitled to. And so that is the story.